Barron Trump. I spent some time with Barron.
He's very smart. He's a good student and all that. Goes to a great school and does really well.
A liberal professor humiliated Barron Trump in front of his classmates, expecting him to stay silent, but she never saw his response coming. Dr. Linda Markham had spent years turning her lectures into political speeches, mixing math with her personal beliefs. She thought she could make an example out of Barron just like she had done to others before, but was she prepared for the comeback that left everyone in shock? Tune in, because what happened next cost her job, her life savings, and everything she had in her life. A classroom showdown no one expected. In a packed lecture hall, a single student sat back quiet but unshaken, his sharp black attire making him stand out while the rest blended into the background. Everyone knew the name, but few really knew the person. Barron Trump wasn't there to argue, to grandstand, or to make some grand statement. He was there to learn. But beneath his calm focus was a mind sharper than most, ready to see through any distraction. Unfortunately for Dr. Markham, she had something else in mind, and math wasn't on the agenda. She was about to learn that some lectures don't go as planned. Before we dive into this, one thing is certain. Dr. Markham had no idea that her words would backfire in a way no one in that lecture hall would ever forget. Her words carried more than just numbers and formulas. There was an edge, a clear intent. This wasn't just a class on calculus anymore. It was something else entirely. A few students exchanged glances, realizing the discussion was drifting from equations to ideology. And then from the back of the room, a single hand went up. Someone had heard enough. Markham hesitated. She didn't expect resistance, especially not from him. Ignoring the hand, she continued, doubling down, claiming privilege dictated success in academics, not effort. She let the words hang in the air, throwing pointed glances at specific students, ensuring her message was clear. The room tensed. Barron remained still, his hand steady, unshaken. Silence stretched. Finally, with visible irritation, Markham gave in. "Mr. Trump, do you have something to say?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. She thought she had him pinned. That assumption was about to cost her. He spoke. Not with anger, not with accusations, but with clarity. He didn't take the bait. He brought the class back to math, to the real reason they were there. He explained the importance of calculus, how it built industries, advanced medicine, shaped the world. It wasn't opinion, it was fact. Students, some who had been silently uncomfortable with the professor's detour, found themselves nodding. Markham stiffened. Her grip on the conversation was slipping. Desperate to regain control, she pivoted, throwing another jab, insisting he could only say such things because of his privilege, that he couldn't understand real academic struggle. But he didn't flinch. He acknowledged it. Yes, he had advantages. And that was precisely why standards shouldn't be lowered for anyone, why education should push people higher, not hold them back. Her face darkened. This wasn't going the way she planned. The room shifted. This wasn't just a debate anymore. Something bigger was happening. Markham, frustrated, tried again, pressing harder, hoping to make him stumble. "And what exactly makes you think you can challenge a professor?" she shot back, her voice sharp. She leaned forward, waiting for the moment he cracked. But he didn't flinch. He didn't shift, didn't search for words. He met her stare, steady, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. "I'm not an expert," he said, his voice clear and calm. "I'm just a student who actually wants to learn math." And with that, he simply raised a hand and pointed. The class followed his gesture to the whiteboard behind her. It was empty. No equations, no numbers, nothing but a blank space where education was supposed to be. The silence that followed said more than any argument ever could. This wasn't a lesson in math, it was something else entirely. The weight of the moment settled over the room. A shift rippled through the students as the realization hit. They exchanged glances. Whispers spread. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Markham had walked in expecting to control the discussion, to make her point, to remind everyone of the authority she wielded. But now she stood in front of them exposed, her power slipping through her fingers. She had assumed he would just sit back and accept what she said. She had been wrong. One by one, students reacted. Some straightened, some nodded, others just watched in silence. Something was changing, something real. Barron hadn't raised his voice. hadn't demanded anything. He had simply revealed what was missing, and in doing so, he had exposed a truth bigger than a single classroom. Education wasn't about controlling ideas, it wasn't about forcing opinions, it was about knowledge. And now, that was impossible to ignore. But Markham wasn't about to let him win. Not publicly, not like this. She had spent years building her authority, her reputation, and she wasn't about to let one student, especially him, make her look weak. Her face remained calm, but there was something cold in her eyes now. If he wanted a challenge, she would give him one. If he thought he was so clever, she would make sure he regretted it. Without a word, she turned, picked up the marker, and wrote a complex equation on the board, convinced this would be the moment he finally faltered. The impossible equation challenge. The classroom felt like a battlefield, everyone waiting for the first strike. Dr. Markham's glare was sharp as she took slow, deliberate steps toward the whiteboard, marker in hand. "All right, Mr. Trump," she said, voice dripping with challenge. "Since you have such strong opinions about mathematics, let's put that confidence to the test." The marker screeched against the board as she wrote, numbers and symbols piling up in a monstrous equation that stretched across the surface. A few students exchanged nervous glances, some even whispering. This wasn't just difficult, this was the kind of problem that sent even seasoned mathematicians into a cold sweat. She turned, smirking as she tapped the marker against the board. "Go ahead," she said, arms crossed. "Show us how it's done. Unless, of course, you'd rather sit down and keep talking about things you don't understand." The words stung, and the challenge was clear: humiliation or victory. The class held its breath, waiting for the inevitable embarrassment. But Barron didn't flinch. He stood up, calm as ever, and walked toward the board. His expression was unreadable, his movements steady. Dr. Markham's smirk widened. This was going to be good. She had deliberately chosen this problem, knowing full well that it required methods far beyond anything taught in the course. There was no way he could pull this off. Then Barron spoke, his voice even and controlled. "Before I begin, I'd like to point out that this problem has more than one approach. Would you prefer I use the standard method or a more efficient solution based on original work by Leibniz?" The room fell silent. Even she hesitated for a moment. "You've read Leibniz's original work?" she asked, the confidence in her voice faltering slightly. "Yes, in the original German. The translations lose some of the finer details." Barron didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The message was clear. This wasn't a bluff. He knew exactly what he was doing. He turned back to the board and without hesitation began to write. His movements were precise, his steps deliberate. The problem that had looked insurmountable moments ago now seemed to unravel under his pen. It wasn't just that he was solving it, he was explaining every step as he went, making it look almost effortless. The class watched in stunned silence, phones slowly being raised to record what was quickly becoming something more than just a math lesson. This first step, Barron continued, was first introduced by Euler in the 1700s. It simplifies what appears to be a complicated integral into something much more manageable. His hand moved across the board, the solution unfolding like a perfectly orchestrated plan. Even students who had struggled with basic calculus before found themselves following along. Dr. Markham, arms still crossed, leaned slightly forward, her eyes darting between the board and Barron's face. She was trying to find a flaw, some mistake she could call out, but none appeared. Barron wasn't just solving the problem, he was teaching it in a way that made more sense than any lecture she had ever given. "Now," he said, nearing the final steps, "we have two ways to proceed. The traditional method would take up another full board, but there's a more elegant approach using a lesser-known principle from Leibniz's notes." He turned to face her. "Which would you prefer?" Her expression was unreadable, her earlier smugness completely gone. The class, still recording, waited for her response. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the silence. "Could we see both?" It was Sarah Chin, one of the quieter students, her voice hesitant but firm. "This actually makes more sense than how it was explained in the textbook." Barron smiled, nodding. "Of course." He turned back to the board and continued. She remained silent, watching as the student she had intended to embarrass took complete control of her classroom. The weight of the moment hung in the air. This wasn't just about solving an equation, it was about proving a point. By the time Barron finished, the entire board was filled, but his work was as clear and clean as a textbook example. He set the marker down and turned back to the class. "And that," he said simply, "is how it's done." The silence stretched for a long moment. Then slowly, a few students began to clap. It wasn't loud at first, but it grew. The energy in the room shifted. Phones were still raised, capturing every moment. The classroom debate had already changed everything, but when Dean Richardson walked in, things took an even bigger turn. A professor's authority put to the test. The classroom door burst open with a loud bang, and in stormed Dean Richardson, a close supporter of her political stances. He barely took a breath before announcing, "Linda, we need you for an emergency faculty meeting. It's about the curriculum changes." The timing was absolutely terrible, or perhaps perfect depending on how one looked at it. She turned to her students, attempting to wrap up the session. "We'll continue this demonstration another time," she said, trying to maintain authority, but before she could take a step, Barron spoke up. "Professor, you gave me a public challenge. You asked me to solve this in front of everyone," Barron said, his voice steady but firm. His words sent a wave of murmurs through the class, and even the dean hesitated. Leaving now wouldn't set the right example about academic integrity, would it? Silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. Dean Richardson's expression darkened, his mouth tightening as if preparing for a scolding. "Young man, are you implying—" "I'm not implying anything, sir," Barron cut in, polite but unwavering. "I'm simply stating that Dr. Markham wanted to make a point about privilege and merit, and I accepted the challenge. The only question is, will she follow through?" The weight of the moment was undeniable. Some students had their phones out, capturing what was clearly turning into something bigger than a classroom debate. She glanced at the marker in her hand, then at the equation on the board, the same problem she had picked to supposedly expose a lack of ability. But now it was her own competence under the microscope. The dean, who had arrived as an authority figure, now found himself just another spectator. The tension grew unbearable. Barron, in a move that left everyone breathless, held the marker out to Dr. Markham. "Or perhaps," he said, a quiet challenge in his tone, "you'd prefer to solve it first. After all, you've made it clear that knowledge is what really matters. As our professor, surely you can walk us through the solution?" The classroom fell into a stunned silence. Her fingers tightened around the marker as if it had suddenly turned to lead. Her mind raced. How had this happened? How had the moment she designed to humiliate one student flipped into an interrogation of her own knowledge? The presence of the dean wasn't a shield anymore. It was a witness, a judge. Phones stayed lifted, capturing every moment. She started, then faltered. Her eyes darted to the board. The equation wasn't impossible, but under this kind of scrutiny, every second felt like a lifetime. Barron, unshaken, extended an olive branch. "We could solve it together. Collaboration often leads to better understanding." There was no mockery in his tone, no arrogance, just a genuine offer. But that made it even worse. Dr. Markham's pride wouldn't allow her to take it. Her jaw clenched. "This is absurd," she snapped, tossing the marker onto the desk. "This entire stunt is nothing but a privileged student trying to undermine my authority." The class collectively exhaled, but the moment of tension didn't dissolve. It shifted. Now it was Barron's turn to pick up the pieces, or rather the marker. He bent down, retrieved it, and met Dr. Markham's fiery gaze with cool determination. "No," he said, voice unwavering, "this is about moving forward." And then, without another word, he turned to the board and did something that would leave the room breathless. In less than 5 minutes, he completed both solutions, the traditional method and an alternative approach. His movements were quick, precise, and completely unshaken. As he wrote the final number, the class exploded into applause. Even the dean couldn't hide his astonishment. But this wasn't the moment that would change everything. That came next. Dr. Markham stood there, her face drained of color, her carefully built reputation starting to crumble. Barron wasn't finished, though. He stepped back, facing both his professor and the dean. "Mathematics doesn't care about politics, backgrounds, or biases," he stated, gesturing at the board. "It only cares about truth. And when we let personal agendas cloud our judgment, we miss the opportunity to grow." The dean cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Trump, while your mathematical abilities are impressive, you must understand that..." Before he could finish, a voice rang from the back of the room. "That what?" It was Michael Chin, a quiet scholarship student who rarely spoke. "That we should learn less math because of someone's political beliefs?" The words cut through the air like a blade. And just like that, the classroom, the faculty, and the institution itself were forced to face a new reality. One where knowledge, not authority, would decide who held the real power. What started as a classroom argument didn't stay in the room for long. Soon, more people heard about it, and the whole school was watching. One lesson that redefined the classroom. Dr. Markham's class was supposed to be about calculus, but instead it had turned into something else entirely. Students were getting frustrated. One stood up and said they came here to learn math, not to get a lecture about privilege. Others nodded, their patience running out. The air in the room was thick with tension, and for a moment it seemed like Dr. Markham was losing control of the class. Then a student did something unexpected. He spoke up, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the noise. He acknowledged that Dr. Markham knew a lot about math, but maybe they should stick to that instead of these other discussions. He even offered to help other students outside of class, blending theory with real problem solving. It was a lifeline, a way for Dr. Markham to keep control without backing down completely. The room fell silent, waiting to see what she would do. Dr. Markham hesitated. Her whole approach had been about challenging privilege and making students think about more than just numbers. But now, faced with the reality of their frustration, she had to make a choice. Slowly, she admitted she had been wrong. She had spent too much time focusing on one issue and had ignored what she was actually there to teach. The shift was subtle, but it changed everything. For the first time, she really saw her students for who they were, not just who she assumed they were. Then came the real shock. Students outside the class had started gathering. Word had spread fast. People were watching the drama unfold in real time, posting videos and reactions online. Soon, a crowd formed outside, holding signs with phrases like "teach math, not politics" and "merit over bias." The situation was about to explode into something much bigger than just a classroom debate. But the student who had spoken up wasn't done yet. Instead of letting things spiral, he walked to the door and spoke to the crowd. If they were here to learn, they should come inside. And just like that, students poured in, filling every seat and standing along the walls. Dr. Markham watched, stunned. She had been struggling to keep students engaged, and now, thanks to him, the room was packed with eager learners. What happened next became legend. He took the marker and turned the class back to what it was supposed to be: math. For the next hour, students listened, asked questions, and actually learned something useful. It wasn't about privilege or politics anymore. It was about numbers, equations, and real-world applications. And for the first time in a long time, Dr. Markham felt like she was truly teaching. The story spread across campus like wildfire. People expected it to be about a professor getting humiliated, but instead it became something else. Enrollment in advanced calculus skyrocketed. Dr. Markham, humbled by the experience, changed her approach. She went back to focusing on what she loved, teaching math. The student who had spoken up, true to his word, led study sessions and helped others bridge the gap between theory and practice. Was this professor trying to teach math, or was she using her position to push an agenda? And did she ever expect Barron Trump to outshine her so easily? Tell us what you think, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.